Welcome everyone. This is the second class of GBMT 1009, Geopolitics of Trade and Development. This will be our first full lecture, which I'll be doing in two parts. Each of them you'll have the link on YouTube. So they'll be placed on Blackboard where you can see both videos. So without further ado, let's get going. Oh, before I get too ahead of myself, I would like to thank everyone who messaged on the discussion board. I'm still waiting on a few of you, but that's fine. It's not for participation grades or anything like that. It's just so I can get to know you and your interests. So if you still haven't done so, feel free to still message me. But remember, it's not for any grades, so it's up to you whether or not you participate in that assignment. Okay, without further ado, the agenda today, we're going to discuss a little bit about the history of geopolitics and some basic terminology. We'll talk a little bit about trade and development. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion on power, especially the types of power and its relevance to the discussion on geopolitics. And we'll end with a discussion on the accountability assignment due this Friday, May 20th, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with the college's requirements for APA format and the intolerance of the department towards late assignments without any medical documentation or an excuse of that level. Medical or bereavement is the only excuses I'm familiar with. So you have to make sure that you hand in the assignments on time, but we'll go over that a little bit later. But without further ado, let's jump into the agenda for this week. Okay, so this picture is very interesting, or these series of pictures are very interesting because each of them underscore a key aspect of geopolitics, right? The first picture on the upper left side is the United Nations, right? It's a body where the negotiations and discussions between states take place over the big issues which impact global governance and world order. These institutions, these transnational institutions, are often understood as part of the liberal international order, which we'll get into a little later. The second slide on the upper right side is a picture of global aid. We'll discuss the various dimensions of aid and how it's distributed, as well as the types of states that deliver this aid and what that position entails in international relations. The third slide on the bottom left-hand side is a massive container vessel, which represents world trade and what a state's ability to engage in world trade means for its development. So we can see here a massive shipping container. This obviously, states that engage in this level of trade, obviously, it implies something to further level of development, and we'll discuss that in detail as well. The fourth slide is what happens with politics when all the other various aspects fail. It represents conflict. We see here a soldier, likely in Afghanistan. And it's politics by other means. It's when the institutions of political economy and international affairs and diplomacy, when all these institutions fail, this is what happens, conflict. And this is very important as well to especially understand global business as well, because when things fall apart, this is also very much impacts global business. So all the pictures are important to geopolitics and global business, and all of them are inseparable from one another. So all the different aspects influence each other and states' relationships. I'm sure many of you have wondered why geopolitics is a crucial course in global business. But I'm here to say in order to be successful in global business, you must understand all of these risks and how they might threaten global business. And that's why there's growing industries such as political risk consultancy, which is part of the recommended reading this week, is one of the most preeminent political risk consultancy in Bremer, is Global Risk Index, which I put on the Blackboard, is your mandatory reading this week. But this is obviously, these aspects, these geopolitical concerns are obviously very, very important to the success of global business in the 21st century. Okay, so geopolitics. It means many different things. It goes back to old German schools of political theory, but it depends on who you're talking with. But generally, concerning that, even though the definitions kind of vary in how they're deployed, et cetera, and what's accentuated if it's more conflict and territorial disputes or political economy concerns, the difference in focus remains between different scholars on geopolitics. But generally speaking, we're going to use it. It will simply mean the relationship between countries and the various factors which influence these relationships, and the nature of cooperation, competition, rivalry, or conflict in international affairs. So all countries have to interact with one another. Even hermit states, such as North Korea, which has a very insular politics, very anti-globalized politics, non-globalized politics, is forced to have still a working relationship with other states in order to reproduce their own individual nation state, whether it be through their interactions with foreign aid, et cetera. All states, or even with trade and development with China, et cetera, they require international relations, even the most insular states. So you can't be an island in the world, right? Canada, for instance, has relationships with every country in the world, various small and underdeveloped countries, which might not necessarily come to mind. So Canada, for instance, has a relationship with Equilateral Guinea, some trade and diplomatic relations, not military, but they do have some relationships. So even these very different, geographically distant, different levels of development, all of these countries have different relationships with one another. Okay. And the nature of these relationships is shaped by a variety of factors. So a major aspect relevant to this course is geography. Geography will contribute to closer relations between the US and Canada than, for example, the Australia and the US. So Canada and Australia, both quite similar countries. We both have colonial history, liberal states. You know, there's various similarities between the states of Australia and Canada. That being said, the United States has a much stronger relationship with Canada on the basis of it being geographically close to one another, making all different aspects of the relationship much easier, whether it's trade, et cetera, right? Population transfers, et cetera. So even though they show various similarities, the neighborhood of your state also drives particular geopolitical relations, right? And we also can look at the multiple factors which might influence a geopolitical relationship. For instance, Russia and the EU, or Germany in particular within the European Union. There's clearly a conflict here over the conflict in Ukraine. There's obviously a divide in interpretation of this conflict, for instance. And it's clearly an issue that divides both the values and ideology regarding this conflict. Where each side has a drastically different perspective lens regarding the conflict, right? Russia viewing it not as an invasion, a special military operation, for instance, is the terminology they use, whereas the European states have overwhelmingly recognized that Ukraine's been invaded by Russia, right? So that'd be one example. However, the trade relationships between Germany and Russia over natural gas, for example, continued during much of the conflict. I think it's kind of tapering off now, but during much of the conflict, due to geographic proximity and the mutually beneficial trade relationship between such states, that relationship continued despite these stark differences, even differences which have led different NATO states and to contribute militarily to the fight in Ukraine against Russia. So we can see the complexity of these relationships too. Such conflicts can also create global crises which reverberate around the world. With issues like what we're facing now with global food shortages, having aspects that are also linked to such things as the conflict in Ukraine, where Russia, the largest fertilizer producer, and Ukraine, the sixth largest wheat exporter in the world. Obviously, this has disrupted these economic activities of these states, right? So these operations are obviously impacted, which has global ramifications. The impacts of the climate, for example, will also weigh on geography, trade, and development. Trade routes, ports, natural resources, and even the occurrences of famines and humanitarian crises, or even war, all impact global business, for instance, right? Power dynamics are also crucially important. And you can see instances where one party seems to benefit much more than other party from certain geopolitical relationships, right? So another huge aspect that we're going to discuss is the power of access to nuclear weapons and how this transforms relationships between states. Such nuclear weapons can be viewed negatively by states in the international community because if geopolitical relations fray deeply enough into conflict, such weapons could be used between states and have global consequences beyond just the states that are in question, which is this is the reason why there's so many international bodies and non-nuclear states who have argued for a complete ratification of nuclear weapons as a potential tool of political warfare, and also, taken many moves to stop the proliferation of these nuclear weapons and the further proliferation of nuclear weapons, which means the expansion of these technologies and these military advances with other states, right? However, similarly, many smaller states have viewed it as a national security priority to have nuclear weapons in order to ward off the threats of larger geopolitical rivals or foes, which might decide eventually to be ambitious enough to invade their territory and posing an existential threat to that state. The Cold War is an interesting example of two nuclear rivals who didn't eventually go to nuclear war, despite the stockpiling of massive amounts of nuclear weapons on each side, mainly due to the belief that conflict was unwinnable for either rival due to what was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD, which would be the idea that if any of the two powers launched a nuke at one, the others would massively launch nukes at the other, and back and forth, and then eventually it's an unwinnable war because there's no population left, right? We can also talk about political ideology. Democracies work well historically with other democracies. However, sometimes it's not the case, so it's obviously very complex there as well. We could talk about historical ties. When we look at the British Empire's history and how this continues to weigh on relations between formerly colonized states with each other, as well as their former colonial power. And we can also look at how historical conflicts also have impacts. We can look at the history of conflicts between neighbors. Good ones, for example, are Pakistan and India, or Russia and Hungary, et cetera, and how these historical conflicts continue to weigh on diplomatic and international relations between these states. So, sorry about that. So these factors impact various aspects of states and how citizens of each state live their lives as well, right? Including their consumption patterns, their cost of living, and even their actual safety of these citizens, right? So we can see that these various factors are not only just these kind of abstract things that happen in the realm of geopolitics, but actually are things that impact individuals living within every nation state. So it's a very this adds a very interesting layer to this too, because it's both a macro level of things happening here, but then also these macro tectonic shifts in geopolitics also influence the day-to-day lives of citizens in every state. It's also important to mention that not all nations are states, but we are primarily going to be speaking of internationally recognized nation states, which are able to engage in the field of international relations and diplomacy with informal institutions, et cetera. Even though with full recognition that not every nation has been awarded a state, whether completely illegitimately, et cetera. But we're going to be focusing primarily on nation states, which we'll go into a little bit more in the part 2 of this lecture. But thank you all for listening to part 1. I hope this was an okay introduction for all of you. And I'll see you all in part 2.